All right, so welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking about racialized women and job crafting at work. So, before I tell you about job crafting, I would like you to reflect on your own working experiences. So, have you ever pursued tasks or projects that were outside of your typical job scope? Have you ever made new or deeper connections with people at work, again, outside of that typical job scope? Have you ever reframed the meaning or your perception of the job? So perhaps thinking about how your small role in an organization connects to a bigger picture. So, if you've done these things, you may have engaged in something called job crafting. So, this is an informal but intentional process where workers make subtle shifts to their jobs to shape their work according to their own personal goals, strengths, and motives. So, this is a really popular construct that's related to various favorable outcomes. So, things like job performance, worker well being, person job fit. And a lot of research has also looked at how job crafting can help workers to cultivate a sense of work meaning. So, job crafting can be considered a form of workplace experimentation that enables workers to achieve or to at least perceive better work. But is this the case for all workers? So, when job crafting was first introduced, the scholars on the screen proposed these three crafting forms. So, there has been newer research that's proposed additional models, but for the purpose of today, we'll just keep it simple. And this model is still extensively used and has been validated in research. So, crafting can involve task crafting, relational crafting, or cognitive crafting. So when workers engage in task crafting, they make changes to their work tasks. So taking on more work, reducing their responsibilities, or changing the way that they do their work in some way. Relational crafting looks like making changes to the quality or the quantity of your workplace relationships. So we can think about an office administrator who notices a lack of knowledge transfer at work and decides to build connections with colleagues in different departments to create a new process for documentation. So this could be an example of task and relational crafting together. Now, these first two forms of crafting are now considered behavioral crafting, and there's also cognitive crafting. So, making changes to your perception or your interpretation of your job. So, you can think about how your job has a different meaning for you personally. You might mentally compartmentalize, or just changing your role identity in some way. So we can think about a cleaner at a hospital, for example, who imbues meaning into their role. So they think about themselves as actually a contributor to patient health and safety. So what we're talking about is really in contrast to work design, which is a top-down process initiated by organizations. So job crafting is bottom up, it's initiated by individual workers, and it's for their own personal benefit, for the most part. So, research suggests that workers in really any job can craft their job to some extent. And there's been a lot of research looking at workers across a variety of jobs. So, what I really want to emphasize is a lot of research proposes this narrative, and the research does back this up, that job crafting allows workers to personalize their jobs, to make small changes that have a big impact for their own benefit, and to not only survive, but to actually thrive at work. And this is actually a really appealing idea for many organizations. So, what we're seeing now is this narrative of we should encourage organizations to encourage their own workers to pursue job crafting. So we're seeing a lot of informal content online, things like blog posts, webinars, and even I think a book has just been released on why organizations should encourage employees to craft their jobs. But as I mentioned earlier, which workers does job crafting really benefit? So, unfortunately, job crafting literature is missing this intersectional piece. So, how does race and gender impact the job crafting process? So, we know from research outside of job crafting that racialized women experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and this can often lead to poor work and mental health outcomes. So, similarly, worker identity might have a meaningful impact on the job crafting process and this pursuit of better work that we're talking about today. So, this is just a really informal and honestly non exhaustive summary of some of those experiences that we know that racialized women experience based on research. So, often they cite a lack of support, they cite experiences of stereotype, exclusion, microaggressions, and they also report having to rely on certain strategies to try and mitigate some of these challenges. So, things like emotional labor and impression management. But unfortunately, these challenges, as well as these strategies, can still lead to poor work and mental health outcomes. So things like burnout, impacts on job performance, worker anxiety, and distress. So I want to take a step back for a second and also clarify something about job crafting. So, we know from research that there are two potential motives for crafting. So, this can be a proactive motive or reactive motive. So, proactive motives have to do with this desire, this intrinsic desire to achieve something, whereas reactive motives typically have to do with coping or gaining control of your environment in some way. And so we can see how these reactive motives might actually be especially relevant for racialized women if they're managing certain challenges at work. So the question for today's presentation is how do racialized women create better work via job crafting? So on the one hand, job crafting can be really useful for women to um, manage some of those challenges that they're experiencing. But on the other hand, could job crafting actually be constrained by some of those challenges, or could it actually worsen some of those challenges? So we set out to conduct a qualitative study on this question. And so we completed 10 semi structured interviews with racialized women working in various administrative roles in a Canadian university. So the roles varied, but they were typically office workers in office jobs rather than other types of staff or academics. And workers typically identified. So we had some who were Asian women, South Asian women, a Black women, and some who identified as Latina. And so we found that workers did engage in various forms of job crafting, including some of those common, typically understood forms of job crafting under the task, relational, and cognitive framework. We also identified some key themes that really demonstrated this interplay between worker identity, the expectation that they felt others placed on them, as well as their job crafting experiences. And I do want to note that this is still a work in progress. So these are preliminary themes. So these actually, if you're looking out for a paper in the future, these may evolve as data analysis continues. So the first theme really had to do with motives for crafting. So I mentioned earlier that, there's those proactive motives out of intrinsic desire to pursue personal interest or passion, or those reactive motives to cope or gain control. But motives are not always so obvious. And so one thing we were finding was that women couldn't really say whether something was born out of a proactive or a reactive motive. And what's really interesting is that across workers, we identified this motive that kind of seemed like it was in between. So it was specifically based in workers' identities as racialized women. And so these women uh, shared that they were able to leverage their personal experiences and rely on their identities in order to better relate to others. And so through this work, they were able to this was linked to this intrinsic desire to serve others with similar identities to them. So, as one participant says, it comes from a deep seated passion. It's a way for me to channel the loss of control in my personal life and the frustrations that I have in the injustice of the world. So, workers described crafting that involved putting in extra work to serve others. So, this could look like going the extra mile to help support racialized students who they had interaction with in some capacity, or it could involve pursuing projects related to equity, diversity, and inclusion slightly beyond their job scope. And again, what was really interesting here was these workers described this perception of being the best person for that extra work, or at least compared to their non racialized colleagues. So, workers also noted that they found others had really specific expectations of them. And these were based on their identities as racialized women. And they described that they felt that these expectations motivated certain forms of job crafting. And these forms of job crafting were perceived as a burden on these women. So, as an example, some workers felt it was their duty to learn about and speak out against injustices in the workplace. And what's really interesting here is that even if workers may have pursued that form of job crafting anyways, based on some sort of intrinsic desire, as was shared by at least one participant, because of that expectation that was placed on them by non racialized others, this really changed their motivation for engaging in that type of job crafting behavior. So that type of work lost the sense of meaning that it may have otherwise had for that worker, for those workers. Now, I do want to be clear that even job crafting that's based in more proactive motives, for so pursuing something just out of general interest or passion, that too could become burdensome. So often workers described facing an emotional toll if they engaged in equity, diversity, and inclusion work. So, given what we've spoken about, the fact that we know racialized women experience specific challenges at work, and it seems that job crafting may not always lead to favorable outcomes for them, are there ways that racialized women can rely on job crafting to try and mitigate some of those experiences? And we did find two key themes related to this. So, the first had to do with strategic boundary setting. So, given the expectations of others and their experiences at work, racialized women often set mental and physical boundaries in order to protect themselves. And so, behavioral forms of this type of job crafting could look like disengaging from certain types of work or taking a pause from certain emotionally charged relationships at work. And so there's this one quote here. So there are some conversations that you just decide not to interact with. You only have so much energy, and you select where you put your energy towards. And this also speaks a little bit to that cognitive element, but mostly what we were seeing with cognitive crafting was this reframe of what the job meant to participants. So this one quote at the end of the day, my job is a job. And what was really interesting about this one participant was she had come into that job with this innate desire to help others and to serve others. And so her job was really meaningful for her. But given her experiences at work, she had to engage in this cognitive crafting to really compartmentalize. And this other protective job crafting strategy had to do with relational crafting, so in the form of finding allies at work. And this was to build community and to further protect themselves. And so, as one participant put it, finding allies and champions, this is important for anyone, but I feel more so because of my identity. And finding allies and building connections at work was a strong theme that we found in our interviews. So I just want to leave you with this question. Um, it looks like I won't be going too much over time, which is nice. So, Whose job is it to create better work? So I mentioned earlier that there is this narrative that's being delivered to organizations that you can encourage your workers to empower themselves to pursue better work. But if we're encouraging organizations to do this, or encouraging even workers themselves to do this, without recognizing the social context, and without doing further research on this topic, this really places the onus on racialized women and other marginalized workers to to create better work for themselves. And it completely ignores the responsibility of organizations and, in fact, of social change. And I think I will leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have later.